Hello, everybody. My name is Rosie Meade, and I'm one of the co-editors of the Community Development Journal. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the first in a series of conversations that we're having online about the articles and content that were included in a recently published theme section of the CDJ. That theme section was focused on the issue of territorial stigmatization, and it was concerned really with exploring the kind of nature of that concept, its implications for communities of disadvantage, but also its implications for the theory and practice of community development. And today on this CDJ YouTube channel, I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce and to welcome Rasmus Birk and Arp Fallov, who co-authored an article for that theme section, and who are today speaking from Aalborg and Copenhagen in Denmark. And they're going to talk us through some of the ideas, concepts, interests, I suppose tensions that have informed their particular article, which I'm going to read out the title of, and it's called Between a Rock and a Hard Place, State-Led Territorial Stigmatization, Informal Care Practices, and the Interstitiality of Local Community Workers in Denmark. It's a really fabulous piece of work. I think it really evokes the kind of contradictions and tensions which lie at the core of community development practice, irrespective of the context within it which happens. It's very accessibly written, particularly for those of us who are not necessarily familiar with the Danish context. And I suppose this is our opportunity to go through some of the issues and ideas that are contained in that article and to explore them in a little more detail. And we also think it's a really nice opportunity for you as readers of the journal and as watchers of our YouTube channel to get a sense of the kind of enthusiasms that are informing the authors who are contributing to the CDJ. So thanks very much for joining us. And hello, Rasmus. Hello, Mia. Great to have you here today. So welcome. I'm welcoming you to Cork, and you can welcome me to Denmark.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yeah,
My absolute pleasure. My absolute pleasure. I suppose, could we start off a little bit with your backgrounds, both of you? And I'd like to get a sense of the kind of your current research interests and if and how they dovetail with your own interest in community development and like where your interest in community development, community work has actually come from.
I don't know who's going to start. Should I start, Rasmus?
Yeah, you go ahead.
Well, I have a long-standing relationship with local community work. It's since way back into the end of the 1990s when I did my master's thesis, but I also did my PhD on local community work, actually comparing the New Deal for community work, a New Deal for communities with the Danish program. So I've sort of followed the development within local community work in Denmark and especially in England, but also other places. And I've sort of, what interests me is that exactly in the local community work, many different policies come together. So you both have social policies, you have workfare policies, and then you have this issue of materiality and kind of the place of living. So it's a sort of when all these things assemble in the neighborhood, it becomes a very interesting mixture to research, I think.
Great. And you, Rasmus?
Yeah, so I did my PhD, which was supervised by Mia, on local community work in Denmark. And what I was really interested in was sort of trying to gauge the practices of local community workers. A lot of the time I found the research literature in Denmark was very focused on either being a bit prescriptive in terms of like what should you be doing or very policy oriented. And there was less of a sense of what is actually going on in the many, local areas, local neighborhoods where sort of local community work loosely understood was going on. So in my sort of PhD research, I focused on that, and that is partly where some of the where this paper comes from. It's partly based on empirical materials I gathered and some that Mia gathered in the same period. My current research interests have moved a little bit away from local community work specifically, and more towards. I have a background in psychology, so it's more moved towards sort of subjectivity, you might call it, and the sort of how people are formed and how they're affected by and how they develop in relationship to the sort of social, material, and cultural environments they sort of inhabit. So I'm still super interested in cities and mental health and local communities, but I've moved a little bit away from specifically Danish local community work.
Okay, great.
So.
That sounds really interesting. And I suppose in that kind of topic of territorial stigmatization, I suppose what would have particularly drawn you to that concept and that kind of and exploring the associated issues?
Do you want to go ahead, Mia, or shall I start?
Well, I mean, I think it's the strength of the concept for me is that it's both discursive and practical and material. So it's kind of not just a question of categorization, but also of ways of doing and ways of living, and it kind of becomes incorporated both in resident ways of looking at themselves and understanding how the outside world look at them, but also on how professionals actually see the residents and the meaning of what they're doing there. So I think it's captures quite well these complex issues.
Yeah, I think as well that, I mean, even before I did my PhD, before I started my PhD research, you know, the concept had been used to try and understand marginalized urban areas in Denmark. I think there was a paper from 2016 where Loic Vakang comments on the Danish Ghetto List, and this entire thing, he says that it's a bad list. I think he comments on it in a footnote in a paper. And there's a thing. I think when you have this sort of particular Danish context, and we'll come back to this, where you literally have a list that's published by the state that names particular areas as ghettos, it is hard to sort of not think about a theoretical framework that focuses on stigmatization of particular territories, because calling an area ghetto is partly, as Mia is also saying, you know, a territorial stigmatization. So I think some sort of engagement with that concept is difficult to avoid when you're working in the context of Danish local community work.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to come back to talk a little bit more about that concept of the ghetto list. And it is really, really interesting because I suppose informally many countries have ghetto lists, but they just don't talk about them in policy terms. That, you know what I mean? They're not actually, you know, actively kind of named in policy circles, but we have them culturally, or everybody knows where they are. That's just kind of, you know, nod to wink idea. So we'll come back to talk a little bit more about that. But I suppose before that, I suppose another issue that's what maybe discussing by way of background is we were chatting about this before we started, and that was the singularity of Danish community work itself. And I suppose it's of great interest to us in the CDJ just how many different kinds of policies and practices kind of can fall between that ambit of community development, and that there is such diversity behind that term. So I think for our listeners, it would be really interesting to hear a little bit more about the kind of particular character of community work and community development in Denmark and where it fits within the architecture of the welfare state.
The issue is actually, I think that local community work started up being quite similar to and also took its professional concepts from the Anglo-Saxon world and the issues of all the way back to also settlement movement and so on. But as time has moved on, and that is the reason why the Danish case is a bit peculiar, is that it's become more and more professionalized and more mainstream. So as it is clearly embedded within state funding, it and the kind of this dual position of being stately funded, but then again the professionals are employed by these local community associations or social housing associations, then they are in a particular situation, which means that they're kind of both advocating local community agendas, but still also have to fit within very tight sort of policy eligibility. So I think that's part of the peculiarities.
Yeah,
and
sorry.
Go ahead.
In some ways, local community work in Denmark is it's not as formalized as social work in a social work department might be in a local municipality, but it is probably, it doesn't, this is my impression at least, it doesn't grow from local communities. It's sort of, it is a bit more top down without necessarily being completely top down, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah.
So
makes sense.
it is sort of deployed in local areas before a community is found, so to speak. So it is a sort of, often at least, it is a sort of, peculiar concept is probably or construct is probably the best way of describing it, that takes on a lot of different forms as well.
It does. I mean, I often think of community work as being done by communities and being done to communities and everything in between those two shades. And it sounds like that in Denmark, you have your own kind of particular kind of placing, which is probably closer to the state, but also complicated a little bit by this relationship with non-state actors as well, which, I suppose brings us very special dynamic to what's going on there also. Yeah.
It's sort of a top-down generated bottom-up development. I think I've written somewhere. I mean, it's and that's because they also, in many cases, the local community workers, they're kind of the anchor point for the meeting between all these different NGOs and organizations and institutions that are all merging in the same area. So they become the kind of go-through point, and they're also the spokesperson for the residents to get new developments going on. So it's kind of and I can see, compared to at least our Scandinavian neighbors, it's they seem to have hold on to a bit more activist sort of approach to local community work. And maybe some Danish local community workers would disagree with me, but I think this professionalization in Denmark means that they are so tied into the funding systems that it actually becomes hard to step outside that agenda.
I mean, what I read in your article resonated quite strongly with me in terms of the Irish context, actually, whereby there had been, until quite recently, not a tradition, but a kind of a policy approach that was very much about, on the one hand, funding community development projects, but giving them a certain leeway in terms of deciding what they wanted to do themselves. So it was much more voluntary-led. And in the context, or after the recession, that there was a much more penalizing approach adopted. And there's now much stronger direction coming from the state about what community workers should do. Very strong focus on employment, very strong focus on returning to education. They're the kind of two big concerns. And that certainly rang bells in terms of what I was hearing with you. So much more of the agenda, the kind of central agenda being controlled by the state. But maybe what was actually happening in the ground being different. Maybe there being process of interpretation and renegotiation and resistance actually happening on the ground as well. And I think that kind of comes through very strongly in your article. And it seems to be what you've said, I mean, in the article, but also just now, that employment, housing seem to be key kind of areas and kind of the key focus point in terms of community development activities. And I mean, this is a kind of a banal question, but I think it's worth asking. In terms of the kind of the community work projects that would exist, like, what are they expected to do? How are they seen as engaging with people on the ground? Like, what kind of work are they expected to perform?
Shall I start, Mia?
Yes.
Yeah. So usually, so one thing we should know, and I think we put this in the article as well, like local community work in Denmark is literally called, like it's difficult to translate. So like it is called in Danish, boligsocialt arbejde, which if you translate directly, it means something like social housing work. So there's already in the name this very strong emphasis on the housing estate, and on the sort of local housing organization. So it really happens mainly in areas of non-profit or public housing, or you might call it social housing, that was sort of built from the 50s and 60s onwards. These sort of big housing estates that were meant for the people to provide cheap, affordable housing for the sort of masses, basically. And which is still a very big sector in Denmark, really. Like it is a big part of the housing mass. So when you have local community workers, what do you call it, working in a project, usually it is regulated by what you can translate as local revitalization plans or local plans for a particular housing estate, usually made in response to or related to this Ghetto List that we can come back to, and usually it'll have a variety of criteria that they sort of want to intervene on. That can be everything from ensuring that more young people of age 18 to 30 enter education and or work. It can be stuff like improving the health of residents. The health part was a very strong factor when I was writing my PhD back in 2014. I think it has lost a bit of emphasis on health, actually. So they focus less on that. A lot of it has an sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit focus on integration of sort of ethnic minorities. There's been a whole stream in the Danish policies recently about combating so-called parallel societies that are sort of imagined as places where Danish values don't exist, which is a whole different thing to discuss. I think that's a big and very political topic. If what is meant by this, does it exist? How do we define a parallel society, and so on? But generally, local community projects are sort of meant to intervene on employment, health, general social problems in the areas, and generating social networks for residents and like engendering good and wholesome communities. Okay. I would say. Mia, is anything I've forgotten of that's like?
Yeah, well, actually, that you yourself have written earlier about that that a lot of these efforts are meant to build bridges back into sort of the to the mainstream society. So either through the pathway of labor market integration or through active participation in organization, NGO work, and so on. So it's kind of built on this assumption that somehow residents in these areas are outside of mainstream society, which is actually not the case in many places. They're actually more active than many other areas, and then actually also engage in a lot of activities. But so it's but the focus has also changed over the decades to becoming more and more focused on labor market integration. So even activities that are meant to foster just well-being or social integration are in the last instance also meant to foster employability in some respects. So
yeah, that's sounding very familiar to me as well. I mean, in the Irish context, this notion of community activation has become quite strong. It's actually, I think, has displaced even the idea of community development. And again, it is this idea, it can be, good health, it can be getting people involved in their neighborhood, but in the final instance, everything should come back to employment. That's really what we're about here. And I suppose this imagined center and this imagined shared set of values which everybody needs to be included in. Do you know what I mean? Or be at least able to demonstrate their willingness to be included in, even if that doesn't necessarily happen. So yeah, it does seem like, and again, this focus on employment becoming more pronounced in recent years than it perhaps was, maybe 10 or 12 years ago. So it does seem that there are real parallels there. We've referred to it a couple of times already, so I think it's worth maybe hearing a little bit more about the concept of the ghetto list and what actual form that takes. I mean, it seems like in one of the, I suppose, the things that comes through in the special or the theme section on territorial stigmatization is the way that territorial stigmatization kind of operates in the culture, it operates in the media, it operates in kind of everyday, kind of parlance. But what you're describing goes a little bit further than that. You're actually talking about like a policy documents or a policy sphere that actively names, particular communities as being part of a ghetto list. And I suppose it'd be very interesting to hear a little bit more about that and what it signifies and what the implications are for those communities that would be included within it.
Yeah, so I think I'll start with this one, and then Mia can add in, especially when I forget stuff I've written before. So this is a pretty large topic that has a long and slightly complex history. So if you sort of boil it down, you mentioned earlier, Rosie, that a lot of countries have sort of informal ideas about which areas are quote unquote ghettos or otherwise become designated as problematic. And Denmark has had that too. But from the mid 2000s, around 2010, it became like directly institutionalized, and there was a legislation made that would sort of that said that the Ministry of Housing, I think it was, had to every year list the amount of ghettos in Denmark. And when you say you have to list the amount of ghettos in Denmark, well, then you also are kind of forced to come up with an idea of like, what is a ghetto?
Yeah.
And they inscribed that directly in the policy, in a policy. So they said a ghetto is an area. There were 3 criteria at first, and they've shifted over the years. But the criteria are usually, one, it has to be what do you call it, an area of non-profit housing, with at least 1,000 residents. It has to have so and so many people who are, what do you call it, of a non-Western ethnicity or descendants of people with non-Western ethnicity. It has to have so and so many people who are unemployed compared to the national average, and it has to have so and so many people who have had criminal sentences. They've added on criteria to this since, and it has become, in like a couple of years ago, they made a new version of this, so that there's now like marginalized areas, and then there's ghettos, and then there's like hard ghettos. But basically, that's sort of the story of this list. Like they every year, the Ministry of Housing literally has to publish this list of sort of non-profit housing areas that fulfill the statistical criteria. So it sort of draws together the fact that Denmark has, like many Scandinavian countries, has very extensive tracking of its residents. So, the Danish statistical agencies have a lot of information about the citizens, who they are, how old they are, where they live, and all times, which makes it easy to actually sort of make these kinds of lists, basically.
Wow.
Let me see if there's anything else. So yeah, I mean, so basically the ghetto list, and we call it ghetto list. It was literally named ghettos in the law from 2000. I think it was from 2010, and then it has sort of, successive governments have sort of changed the terms a little bit, sometimes calling it marginalized areas, and then back to ghettos. And now I think they're changing the name one more time, but usually in sort of the public arena, it is often referred to as literally the ghetto list. So yeah.
But it also has consequences, so it's not just categorizing these areas. It's also then a question of who can move into these areas. So if you are already in the areas, among the areas on the ghetto list, then you cannot move in if you are unemployed, and you cannot allocate housing or refugees, for example, to this area, or at least the degree of refugees being allocated is less. And there's also, then there's different tools of making privatizing parts of, it's sort of similar to what we've seen, at least in England. I don't know, I guess it's sort of similar in Ireland as well. Recently also, it's quite radical, because those that are on the ghetto list for more than 4 years, then they have to reduce the degree of concentration of social housing with 60%. So it's quite dramatic that they have to actually relocate thousands of people, and actually also tear down housing units, which there's big loans in also. So it's actually quite a conundrum how they're going to solve this. It's still being implemented, and but yeah, it has quite radical consequences.
Clearly it does. I mean, yeah, and clearly, like, there are issues of race and class that are cutting through that, but also, like, the privatization of the housing stock, presumably, and that would seem to be also part and parcel of what you're describing as well.
Yeah. There's this ideal of social mixing. So I mean, that that is sort of roaming around Europe, but the more you can mix the residents and mix types of ownership, the more then the rationale is, the more cohesive, socially cohesive it would be. I think it's what you call that, false image, because doesn't necessarily make people meet and interact, but yeah.
No, it doesn't. And it also, I suppose, kind of rides roughshod over any kind of internal solidarities within existing communities. So this assumption that by virtue of certain statistical characteristics that we can read off and understand how people interact with each other, and that their ways of interacting with each other are flawed and problematic and dangerous or risky. I mean, these are very heavy duty assumptions, but I think you get those assumptions in quite a lot of different kinds of regeneration policies. So you mentioned in the UK, so similar things have happened in the Irish context as well, where there's just an assumption that large-scale public housing is by definition a problem, and that the people who live within it are by definition problems as well. And it seems like a similar ways of understanding. So we don't call it the ghetto list, but it seems to be, operating in a very similar way. Yeah.
Yeah. The list also functions. I mean, it flattens a lot of things in a way, like once an area is on this list, then it is defined as a ghetto, and there can be a lot of different particularities about that area, a lot of unique factors. It can have a particular history, local communities, and so on, that sort of fade away, because now what people see is that it is a ghetto. So that is also, I think, like, the list has a lot of different effects. So you could really spend a lot of time thinking about what sort of flattening the uniqueness of each area is one of them. And that is what local community work, to return to that, sometimes adds back into the mix, is to have a sort of more localized and specialized approach to the particular areas by virtue of knowing the residents and knowing the local histories and so on.
Yeah, and it's also what they react against, and what also residents react against, is the arbitrariness of the, because then if you have one family moving into the area where, for example, the son is convicted of some crime, then actually you can tip over into the ghetto character. I mean, it often a question of actually comes down to very few families, and then it becomes sort of arbitrary and not representative of how lives are lived in these areas.
Yeah,
exactly.
It does show as well, I suppose, what you're describing there does show the value of a more finely grained kind of understanding of the realities of life in communities, and and how these statistical pictures can be very distorting of the kind of complexities and the kind of relationships and the just the ongoingness of kind of relationship building within community context. And I thought that your use of the word interstitiality, I find it difficult to say that word, actually.
Yes.
But so you're going to have to pronounce it properly for me, because I'm not sure, I'm struggling slightly with it. But it's a good word. It's a really good word. And I think you really bring that word, like, that's kind of very much at the core of what you're actually writing about in this article. I suppose, just again, for the benefit of people watching, would you kind of mind explaining how you understand that concept of interstitiality, and why it's a useful way of conceptualizing our thinking through community work?
Yeah, so the thought by thinking about interstitiality is that sort of local community workers in Denmark are sort of in between. I mean, we could have called it in between, but we didn't for some reason. I mean, but they're very much, it refers to some sort of space that is in between other spaces, right? And local community workers in Denmark the state publishes the Ghetto List, right? So the state designates particular areas for interventions, like Mia mentioned, and has done so for 10 or so years. But the people who are made responsible for the actual local areas are the residents themselves, because these are areas of non-profit housing. The local housing association is made responsible for it. So the local housing association must sort of publish a revitalization plan and get everything together. And they can then apply for funding from the National Housing Association, Landsbyggefonden in Danish. So really what you're doing by doing this is you're making residents themselves across the country responsible for intervening upon particular areas of non-profit housing, if that makes sense. So this is all initiated by the state and by national politicians, but you're really making the local residents responsible for it, and it becomes a few steps removed from the state. At the same time, it is obviously not completely dissociated from the state. So local community work sort of is in this sort of strange position of working with residents and being quite So me and I did, participant observations with local community workers, and we followed them and we interviewed them and so on. And they were often very, very close to residents, knew them personally, helped families and individuals for for years, and knew them quite well. So they were very close to some residents, not everyone. At the same time, they weren't part of the state, and they weren't perceived by residents as being part of the state. At the same time, this is a type of work that is, at the end of the day, initiated by state and political initiatives. So thinking about how they are interstitial in between was really sort of an empirical necessity, if that makes sense. It was something that came out of the empirical materials, trying to think about this sort of strange position that is different from the social workers you might imagine work within a municipality. Child protection services are similar. That can be much more regulated, and where you sort of are not in doubt that these workers are part of the state or the local municipality or whatever. But local community workers kind of constantly, and we describe this in the paper, on the one hand would be quite aware they were part of the state and part of the system, as one of them called it. And on the other hand, trying to hide it, trying to not be part of it, so trying to sort of constantly balance between knowing that, right, I am here because this area is either on the ghetto list or at risk of ending up on the ghetto list, so we are trying to intervene before that happens. At the same time, I don't want to be perceived as part of the state or part of the system, because that can make the work harder. So that is sort of what we're trying to get at with this sort of interstitiality, basically.
Yeah, it's a very useful idea. And I think, because actually I think there are kinds of professional practice where actually stressing that you are part of the state infrastructure becomes really important as part of the kind of armature of work. So what you seem to be describing there, and it's very much whereby the qualitative interviews and the observation work really is very strong in terms of illustrating the kind of the dynamism and the complexity of what actually happens, in the everyday, forms of relationship, that community workers are constantly sort of, I suppose, conscious of this kind of hybrid relationship they have. They are the state, but they're not the state. They're, with people, they're beside people. Do you know what I mean? And those constant, there's kind of a constant negotiation there. And you also talk about them trying to establish a freedom of method in terms of how they work. And I'd be interested even just in terms of some illustrations of what does a freedom of method look like, or what, how do they practice that in some kind of, I could imagine it could be quite small things, but hugely important in terms of people's everyday experiences of them as workers.
Yeah, the freedom method, I think that was actually something that at least some of the people I interviewed in one of the projects I followed literally said to me that they had a freedom of method. So it was important for them to emphasize that when they were dealing with residents, they decided what to do, how to act, basically. So there was no one, that's the way I understood it, there was no one looking them over the shoulder and being like, why did you say this to this person in that way? Why didn't you do it like this? And there was very little demand for documentation. There was very little demand for, as you see in other professions, evidence-based practice, where you have to follow a manual and do things this and that way. That didn't really exist. So it really meant that people could do what they felt was necessary. And that could be very small, but mundane things, like giving a person a ride to get to a job interview, teaching a group of women to ride a bicycle, which that's from another publication I wrote. It could be things like, in one of the projects I visited, there was a health initiative where people could get acupuncture and stuff like that. So it was sort of very small things that they sort of decided, this works for us. If we think this could be a good idea, this is what we're going to deal with. It could be things like, so when I did the fieldwork, it was in 2015, and there were a lot of refugees coming to Denmark at that period, in Europe generally. And a lot of residents would come into the one of the projects I followed with, letters and paperwork from the local government or the local municipality in Danish that they couldn't understand. And some of the local community workers would spend time helping them translate it and understand what's happening and help them communicate with local authorities and making sure the bills were paid and so on. And that kind of stuff is very mundane, but can be super important for a life. And it's not really anything you'd find in a manual somewhere, or it's not really anything that would sort of be counted if you did evidence-based statistical stuff here. So that's kind of what I think we mean by freedom of method and sort of the sort of small scale stuff. Is there anything I've forgotten here, Mia?
No, but I mean, it's also, I think the reason why they press this so much is actually because some of them are also employed by the municipality in part of their time, and they do regular kind of social work or something that are very decided by manuals and guidelines and how many interviews you should have and how many conversations. But I mean, I think it's a question of both timing and documentation and a question of establishing trust relations. But it's also a question of being able to do more creative stuff to generate collective action in some ways that are sort of needed in that particular area. But in some ways, I'm not so sure, because in some ways also different type of international programs are also flooding in over local community work. So, so in some ways, some manuals appear now, and also the level of documentation has gone up, and so on. So, yeah, you can question how much they actually stand outside of bureaucratic ways of doing things.
It sounds like that it's a kind of a struggle, an ongoing struggle within the, for the workers themselves. But I mean, certainly that notion of this kind of floods of information being required, this kind of monitoring, this kind of highly regulated, feedback mechanisms, feedback loops to funders, and that, I mean, that I think that's a story that is very common across community development and community work internationally. And I think the dominance of this kind of evidence-based idea as well, and evidence of what really, and like what community work, like what works in community work, I think depends on the question that you're asking, really. Like, what are you trying to do in the first instance? What's its purpose meant to be? But the kind of manual approach kind of assumes that we can sort of set that out from the very beginning, and you can work in a very I suppose in a very kind of directed kind of way. And what your article, I think, is conveying is that that community workers, by necessity, by choice, by the reality of life in communities, are drawn into much more interesting kind of relationships with the people that they work with, and that it can be predicted at a policy level, but what happens on the ground is much more dynamic than maybe as it was expected. I mean, that's my sense of what you're talking about.
I think that's a good way of putting it. And there was an analysis, like a statistical meta-analysis thing that came out of Danish local community work, looking at do these interventions really work? And I think, and Mia, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think what they found is that they couldn't really find an effect. But when, like, overall some of the areas were still had unemployment and so on, but that doesn't mean that local community workers didn't have an effect on a person's life, on helping someone in like the small things that can still matter. That makes sense. So there's a sort of a qualitative effect, if you can call it that maybe didn't mean that this the particular area were removed from the ghetto list or whatever, but it could have an importance for a person in their life, sort of, on the ground. So there are things happening small scale that can be quite important. That's sort of my impression from doing the fieldwork back then.
Yeah.
And I think also it's important because actually this sort of relative freedom of method means that actually they are often experimenting and developing methods also of developing employability, for example, that are then sort of drifting into the mainstream. When you follow it for many years, you can see how some of these methods or ideas of how you should mobilize people or mobilize resources are kind of drifting into mainstream social work, for example. And and then they become appropriated and sort of taken up as a sort of a mainstream project. So.
Yeah. I think one thing that's also important is to sort of stress that the interstitial position that we talk about is super important for this work to succeed, because if residents in a local area code you easily as the state or the municipality, then you're going to have a hard time sometimes reaching out and finding some vulnerable residents or people who don't trust the state for various reasons. So being able to sort of have an ambiguous position was actually quite important for this work to work, so to speak.
Yeah, I agree. I think there probably would be a lot of pushback against some very kind of controlling, we are the big heavy state, we're coming in here to make you do this. I mean, I think people would say, okay, enough of that. We have enough of the state in so many aspects of our lives, we don't need it. Do you know what I mean? Like in this sphere also. I mean, that brings me on to my last question, which is really relates to, I suppose, the idea of resistance. And I suppose I'm seeing what you're describing about the community workers and their practice as a kind of resistance, as practice as a kind of resistance, as kind of freedom of method, trying to, to bring something creative where you can. But I'm also interested then more generally in terms of, and maybe going back to like some of the ideas around workfare, some of the ideas around territorial stigmatization that we were talking about earlier. To what extent are communities themselves, irrespective of community workers, do they push back against the kind of designation of territorial stigmatization? Like, are communities saying, like, we don't want to be called this? Do you mean, like, are there groups of activists, within areas coming back and saying, stop talking about us in this way? Or, I mean, we don't like what we're hearing in relation to the way the popular culture, the media, the government is actually talking about us. Because that, again, is a different type of community activism, a different kind of community work. And I just was wondering, how visible or evident is that in the Danish context?
Well, surprisingly, not so much. I mean, it's been a bit more recently because the consequences of the recent reform, where they actually tear down quite a lot of housing units, is quite extreme, and there's been a bit more mobilization of residents. But the problem is also that these are people who often maybe have two jobs, or PTSD or something. I mean, maybe it's actually hard for them to mobilize resistance in a sort of, or they're sort of not heard. That's the other part. But there's been podcasts, there's been articles, there's been different academics trying to speak up now. I mean, quite a lot of people within community research have spoken up against the consequences of these latest reforms and trying to mobilize sort of a political voice. But the problem is that actually these reforms are actually there's quite a lot of consensus around with the political parties behind it, and the mainstream Denmark is sort of is not affected by the consequences of that would affect these particular populations. So unfortunately, there's not enough mobilization or activism to actually make real resistance. But what we've written about in another piece is that there's that doesn't mean there isn't resistance. I mean, we touched upon that there's resistance against different forms of classifications. We also talked about today that there's all these kind of mundane activities that supports the resilience of residents. But I also think that what the community workers do, and which is really important, is try to assist these young people who are, for example, young people who are angry about state intervention or feel excluded and stigmatized, and trying to mobilize either in creative ways or kind of mobilizing their energy into productive, what is seen as more productive and visible voices. And so in that sense, but yeah, wouldn't you say, Rasmus, there's actually surprising little resistance to this quite radical reforms?
Yeah, I think there's different ways of seeing the resistance. Like, there's always been, every year when the list comes out, there's always some local residents who are interviewed and who claim that their area isn't a ghetto. The other areas might be ghettos or whatever, but their area isn't. So you always have, but I'm not sure. I mean, if that classifies as resistance, depends on your definition of resistance, I guess. And then you have local politicians in the affected cities are often critical of the list and the policies. So that's has been at least some schisms between local politicians and then the national, politicians in the Danish parliament, from which a lot of these policies are driven and originate. So that's a schism there, but I'm not sure. And then, Mia's correct that it is really with the latest iteration of the law where they can now tear down housing and evict people that you have seen more resistance towards this, and you have seen more publication, like more newspaper articles about it, and you have seen there's a lawsuit, I think, still going on, suing the Danish government for, I think, discrimination. They're claiming that the law is illegal because it discriminates on grounds of ethnicity. I think the lawsuit is still going on. I think they lost one of the cases.
Yeah,
but
they
have
lost
appealed.
the first. Yeah.
So I mean, that is probably the strongest form of resistance there has been so far.
Okay, and obviously to an element of what we're talking about that has real material effects, because in terms of where people are actually living, so it sounds like that maybe if that policy in terms of knocking down houses and that continues or exacerbates, that may become a flashpoint in terms of the kind of wider classification index.
I think in some ways, I mean, ironically, the list has in previous iterations been a bit of a mixed blessing. I mean, maybe blessing is the wrong word, but in some senses, being on the list has given some areas more funding. Like there have been renovations done and more work done on the local infrastructure and more money towards local community projects, which maybe, and because it maybe hasn't had that as strongly material and visible effects as it does now, has maybe meant that there hasn't been a significant proportion of resistance. I don't know, what do you think about that, Mia? Is that a fair statement or?
Yeah, but it's also, I think it's also a question of what is resistance. I mean, these groups of people are maybe not the most resourceful, and I think it's actually difficult for them to actually get their voice heard anywhere. So there is quite a lot of resistance, but it might not actually reverberate in actual political action, really.
So it's not necessarily, it maybe exist, but it's just not registering in the corridors of power. It's not registering. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's been really fascinating, and it's been absolutely lovely to talk to you both about this. I hope you've enjoyed it. But it wasn't
I have. Yes,
our experiment in extending the conversations. So I'm going to say goodbye to our listeners now, and stop the recording. But the plan is to include links to the article in question, the one which was as part of the actual YouTube recording as well. So those of you watching will be able to follow up by reading the article directly. So I'm going to say goodbye to our listeners, and I'm going to stop recording now. So thank you.